Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I still remember the first night I heard the footsteps. It was around 1 in the morning and I was in my small office near the back corridor on the ground floor. The building was dead quiet, except for the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a set of footsteps on the floor above me. They weren't slow and they weren't fast, but they had a steady rhythm. I felt my spine tighten and my breathing got shallow. I just sat there listening, trying to figure out if I was imagining things, but the steps kept going for about half a minute before fading away. I checked the security monitors right afterward, but there was nothing except static. That was the beginning of everything. My name is Alex and I've been the night caretaker in this old commercial building for about 2 years. It's a place that used to be busy during the day with offices and small businesses, but most of the tenants left when the owner raised the rent last year. Now, only a handful of offices still operate here, and most of those close around 6 or 7 in the evening. By midnight, the entire place is empty except for me and maybe a couple of late working people in the shared workspace on the second floor. But they usually leave by 10 or 11. After that, I'm completely on my own. I don't usually feel lonely. I'm not a social guy. My shift starts at 9 p.m. and ends at 5 a.m. I follow a simple routine. I walk around to check each floor, make sure the doors are locked, make sure no homeless person slipped inside, that kind of thing. I have a small desk in an office behind the main lobby where I keep an eye on the security cameras. I used to spend most nights flipping through phone apps or reading random articles online. But ever since I started hearing these footsteps, I've been on edge. The second night it happened, it was maybe 12:30 a.m. I had just finished my second patrol of the building. I grabbed a coffee from the vending machine in the lobby and walked back to my office. A few minutes later, I heard those footsteps again. They sounded like they were coming from the 3rd floor. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I put down my coffee, stood up, and made my way upstairs with my flashlight. Each step I took felt heavier than usual. My heart was pounding and I was breathing a little faster than normal. When I reached the 3rd floor, I didn't see anyone. The corridor was empty. I used my flashlight to check all the corners, even looked inside the restrooms, but I found nothing. The floor was completely silent. I walked back to my office and rewound the security footage, but all the cameras on the 3rd floor showed static during the time I heard the footsteps. Every other camera on the other floors was perfectly clear. That was the first time I realized something strange was going on with the feed. Over the next few nights, the footsteps grew more frequent. They always came after midnight, sometimes around 12:15, sometimes around 1 a.m. Sometimes they sounded distant, like they were at the far end of the corridor on the top floor. Other times, they seemed so close that I expected to see someone walk past my door. Each time I ran to check the area, but it was always empty. The cameras kept showing static whenever the sounds occurred. I tried to tell myself that maybe there was some electrical interference, or maybe the old pipes were making those noises. I knew that old buildings can creak and groan at night. But these weren't random creaks. They were actual footsteps, one after the other, with a steady pace. I started to notice that the footsteps would follow a pattern. Walk for a few seconds, pause, walk for a few more seconds, pause again. It was like someone was patrolling the hallways the same way I did. After about a week, I started losing sleep during the day. I'd lie in bed, picturing those empty corridors and the sound of steps echoing through them. My boss didn't believe me when I told him. He thought I was just working too many hours. So I stopped telling him about it. I decided I'd figure it out on my own. One night I set up my phone to record on the 3rd floor while I listened for the footsteps. I wanted some proof that I wasn't going crazy. I placed my phone near the center of the corridor, hit record, and left it there. Then I went back downstairs and waited. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. They were right above me on the 3rd floor. I waited until they stopped, then I rushed upstairs to collect my phone. But when I played back the video, The screen was just black after 30 seconds, and the audio turned into a high-pitched whine right at the moment the footsteps started. I felt my stomach clench. I had no idea how that could happen. The phone was fine before I set it up. The battery was charged. The memory was far from full. But the file got corrupted in the exact time frame I needed. A few nights after that, I decided to confront whatever was making the noise. At around midnight, I started walking the corridors the same way I always did, but I stopped in certain places to listen closely. I wanted to see if the footsteps would begin while I was already on the same floor. Nothing happened at first, so I kept moving. I reached the second floor and stood near the elevator waiting. Then I heard footsteps on the third floor. I bolted up the stairs as fast as I could and burst into the third floor corridor. The footsteps stopped. I felt my muscles tense. My flashlight beam shook a little because my hands were trembling. I checked every corner. Empty. I felt a wave of nausea. My legs were weak. I forced myself to breathe slowly and calm down. I walked over to the windows at the end of the corridor. I pressed my hand against the cold glass. Outside, the street was dark. The only light came from the flickering street lamp. Cars passed by every now and then, but that gave me no comfort. I turned around and looked back down the corridor. Everything was still. I decided to head back to my office. On my way down the stairs, I thought about the pattern of the footsteps. I realized they seemed to match the route I took during my rounds. First floor, second floor, third floor. I always start at the top and work my way down, or sometimes start at the bottom and work my way up. These footsteps also moved in a sequence from floor to floor, but not always the same direction as me. I started to suspect that they were copying me in some way, following the same schedule but offset by a few minutes. As the nights passed, I noticed the footsteps were getting closer to my office. At first, they stayed mostly on the upper floors. Then they moved down to the second floor, right above my office. Eventually, I could hear them in the corridor leading to my door. By the time they reached the ground floor hallway, I felt on the verge of panic every time I heard them. I'd sit there, heart pounding, staring at the door handle, expecting it to turn. It never did, but the footsteps would stop right outside, like someone was standing there. One evening, I decided to film the camera monitors with my phone to see if I could catch them changing to static at the exact moment the footsteps sounded. Around 12:45 a.m., I heard the steps on the ground floor. I pointed my phone at the monitor, which showed the hallway just outside my office. The image flickered, then turned to gray static. Meanwhile, the footsteps grew louder, and I couldn't see anything on the screen. Then the footsteps stopped. The static cleared a second later, revealing an empty hallway. I replayed the video. The footage showed the hallway one moment, then static, then the hallway again. The audio captured the footsteps, but it was so distorted that it almost sounded like a glitch. I saved that file, but it didn't help me understand what was happening. After a few weeks of this, I started to dread coming to work. My boss noticed I seemed jumpy, but I told him it was just stress. He offered to switch me to a day shift, but that would have meant a pay cut, and I needed the money. So I stayed on nights. I started to keep the radio on in my office to have some background noise. It helped a bit, but not much. I'd still hear the footsteps whenever they started, because they were so distinct. One night, I was walking the corridors earlier than usual, around 10:30 p.m., hoping I could wrap up my rounds and then stay locked in my office until morning. I moved from the first floor to the second, then to the third, checking each office and door. While I was checking a supply closet on the second floor, I had a sudden thought. I realized that the footsteps always matched the path I took in the previous night's routine. I decided to test that, so I varied my route. I went to the fourth floor first, then down to the first floor, then up to the third, then the second. It was a random order, not my usual pattern. Sure enough, the next night, I heard the footsteps start on the fourth floor, then move to the first, then to the third, then second. That's when I understood that whatever this was, it was copying my exact routes, but doing it during the following night. I felt my heart beat faster when I made that connection. The realization felt heavy in my chest. There was no reasonable explanation for that. It made me question everything, but I tried to stay calm. After discovering this pattern, I started to plan my patrols more strategically. I set up small markers in certain places, like a trash can slightly moved away from the wall or a piece of tape on the floor, just to see if anything else happened. Sometimes the markers were moved back to their original spots, but I never caught anyone doing it. The cameras were no help. They always showed static during the times the footsteps were heard. On one particularly tense night, around 1 a.m., I heard the steps coming down the third-floor hallway. They moved right above me in the second-floor corridor. Then I heard them on the stairs, heading toward the ground floor. I stood next to my office door with my flashlight turned off, keeping myself as quiet as possible. My heart was racing and I could feel my pulse in my temples. The footsteps reached the end of the hallway. They stopped for a few seconds. I stopped breathing. Then they resumed, heading back toward the stairs. I felt a surge of relief, but it was mixed with a weird kind of dread. I grabbed my keys, locked the office door, and followed. I kept some distance because I was scared to confront whatever it was. My hands were sweating. My body felt tense all over. I could hear my own shoes scuff the floor as I tried to move quietly. The footsteps moved to the second floor again, and I followed up the stairs. Right when I reached the landing, the footsteps stopped. I looked around the corridor. It was empty. I stood there for a minute, breathing heavily. Then I slowly checked each office. Nothing was out of place, but I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up. Eventually, I returned to my office and sat in my chair. I stared at the monitors, which were all clear. I listened for more footsteps, but I heard nothing. The rest of the night was quiet. I spent that time trying to figure out why this was happening. The only conclusion I kept coming back to was that some presence was mirroring my own roots and footsteps, but I didn't know why or how. I felt a deep unease that I couldn't shake. By the next week, I was barely functioning. I tried everything, checking the electric system, the ventilation, the old floorboards. I never found a normal explanation. I even asked the remaining tenants if they'd ever heard anything weird at night. A couple of them said they heard noises, but they assumed it was me doing my rounds. Nobody else seemed to care. That made me feel even more alone in this situation. The final straw happened when I was patrolling the second floor around midnight. I was listening carefully, waiting for any sign of those footsteps. Then I heard them start on the first floor, but instead of the usual slow pace, they came faster, heading up the stairs. I stood there in the corridor, gripping my flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. The footsteps reached the second floor landing and paused. I backed up slowly, my breath shaking. Then I heard them move toward me. Step by step, they matched the exact pace I use when I walk through that hallway. My chest felt tight. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. I turned around and rushed to the stairwell that leads back down. I raced to my office, locked the door, and watched the camera feed. Static replaced the corridor camera. When it cleared, nothing was there. But I heard the footsteps right outside my office door. My hands were trembling so much that I dropped my flashlight. I bent down, picked it up, and turned it on. Then the footsteps moved away. That was it. They just left. Now, every night I wait for the footsteps to begin. I track them, I mark down the times, and I watch the cameras glitch out each time. I don't know what else to do. There's never anyone visible, yet the footsteps follow my path from the day before. They always come closer, and I still don't understand how or why. I just know that when midnight rolls around, I'm on edge, listening for every small sound. That's my life now. I keep doing my job because I need the paycheck, but I can't shake the feeling that something is walking with me in this building, retracing my steps, echoing my routine. And no matter how many nights pass, I can't find a logical explanation. All I can do is keep listening, keep recording, and keep trying not to panic every time I hear my own footsteps echo in an empty hallway. I want to start by saying I've spent years taking photos of abandoned buildings. I've walked through empty factories with ceilings ready to collapse and rotted wooden floors that creaked under my boots. I've climbed towers with broken stairs and risked losing a leg more times than I can count. But none of that ever spooked me the way an old mansion outside town did. I want to be very direct about this. I'm used to dark hallways, strange sounds, and dusty corridors. But I never saw reflections of people in my shots when there was no one else around. That's what happened this time, and it made my skin crawl in a way I've never experienced before. I remember the first time I heard about this place. A friend mentioned it in passing. He said there was a decrepit mansion near the edge of an overgrown field, about 20 miles from the city. He had no interest in it, but I felt a spark of curiosity. It wasn't on any map. I decided to check it out for my portfolio of old architecture. I drove there on a Friday. It was late in the afternoon and the sky was gray. The house looked large from a distance. The trees surrounding it were tall, and their branches were twisted. The grass and weeds were waist high, and I had to push my way through. My shoes got soaked from the dampness. The mansion itself was 2 stories tall, made of old stone, with a few windows missing. The wood on the porch looked warped. The paint around the windows was peeled and flaking. I could see a broken gutter hanging from the roof. All of this was normal for an abandoned property. I felt that usual rush of excitement. My camera bag felt heavier on my shoulder than normal, probably because the air felt thick. I wasn't scared at that point, just eager to start shooting. I set up my tripod in front of the mansion. I wanted to capture the entire facade. I took a few wide-angle shots, tested different exposures. I use a high-resolution camera, so I'm used to picking up tiny details. I didn't see anything odd at the time. A few crows were perched on the roof, and they made soft, croaking sounds. The front door was slightly ajar, and the hinges looked rusty. I snapped photos of everything. I walked around the porch, checked out the windows, but I couldn't see inside very well because the interior was dark. The glass on some windows was cracked. I felt a light breeze on my neck. I heard rustling in the overgrown bushes. It might have been a rodent or something. That's normal in these places. After about an hour of external shots, I decided to try going inside. The front door opened with a creak. I stepped in, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was musty, like wet wood and old carpet. The foyer was covered in dust. I could see footprints in the dust, but they seemed old. They weren't mine. I've seen footprints in empty buildings before, so it didn't strike me as strange at the time. People sneak into these places. Sometimes they sleep there, or they're just exploring. I walked slowly, shining a flashlight around. The walls had peeling wallpaper and the floors had some deep cracks. I took a couple of shots with the flash on. I made my way into a living room. There was a large fireplace full of soot and an old couch with torn fabric. I took some more shots. Every now and then, I heard a soft tapping coming from somewhere upstairs. It could have been loose shutters or something brushing against the walls. I've learned to tune out random noises in abandoned places, but something about this tapping felt rhythmic. I paused a few times to see if I could figure out where it was coming from. It stopped when I stopped, then started again whenever I moved. It made my nerves tingle, but I tried to ignore it. I walked upstairs carefully. The banister felt unsteady under my hand. The second-floor hallway was narrow and most of the doors were closed. I tried opening one, but it was stuck. I took a photo of the hallway. With the flash, I saw bits of dust swirling in the air. The tapping continued, somewhere behind the walls. I decided it wasn't worth forcing the doors. I took a few more shots of the hallway, then I headed back down. I felt uneasy by then. My shoulders were tense. I just wanted to wrap up. I took some pictures of the porch from inside and then I left. I drove home, loaded my photos onto my computer and started reviewing them. The outside shots looked crisp. I zoomed in to check the stone details. That's when I saw something that made me recoil in my chair. In one of the windows on the top floor, I could see a faint reflection of a face. It wasn't my reflection. I know how to spot my own shape when I'm taking a shot. This was someone else. I leaned in, bringing my face closer to the screen. It looked like a middle-aged woman's face. Her eyes seemed to be looking directly into the camera. I felt a jolt in my gut. I scrolled through a few more shots, and in another photo, I saw a partial reflection of the same face in a different window. It was faint, but it was there. I felt sweat building on my forehead. The more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just one person. I saw two faces in total. One was the middle-aged woman, and the other seemed like an older man, maybe in his 50s or 60s. They appeared in different windows, never together in the same shot, but always looking at my camera. In one picture, the reflection was so clear that I could see the lines on the man's forehead. My hands were shaking a bit. I tried to breathe normally, telling myself it was probably a weird trick of the light, but I knew that was unlikely. My camera is top-notch. I know how reflections work. There was no one there when I was outside. I know I was alone. I spent hours going through each photo, zooming in on every window. There were around 10 shots with reflections. Each time it was either the woman or the man. Their expressions never changed. They just looked blank, like they were staring out at me. I felt a dull ache in the back of my head. I realized I had goosebumps on my arms. I shut my computer down and tried to get some sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day I decided to go back. I wanted to see if there was some explanation, like a trick of the glass. I drove out there in the morning. The sky was clear and bright. The field still had the same tall grass, and the mansion looked the same. I walked around to the windows, trying to figure out how a reflection could form. I looked at the angles, the way the sun was hitting the glass. Nothing seemed unusual. I took more pictures, checking them on my camera's screen every time. I didn't see anything odd in the previews, but that didn't mean much. The small screen can't show me the same detail as my monitor at home. I decided to go inside again, but I felt more cautious this time. I held my flashlight in one hand and my camera in the other. The house was silent. That weird tapping from before didn't happen. I looked in every room, opened some doors that weren't locked. I kept snapping photos. My chest felt tight. My breath was shallow. I kept expecting to see someone step out from a corner or appear behind a doorway, but there was no one. The place was deserted. The couch in the living room was still there, the fireplace unchanged. Dust coated everything. I climbed the stairs again, checking each room on the second floor. Most rooms were empty, just broken furniture and dusty floors. In one room, I found an old metal bed frame and a stained mattress. The curtains were torn, and they swayed slightly in a draft. I felt a cold chill on my neck and the hair on my arm stood up. I heard a faint squeaking sound, like a loose hinge. I spun around, shining my flashlight. Nothing. My mouth felt dry. I forced myself to keep going. I took a few more photos and then left. My heart was pounding by the time I stepped outside. I could taste a metallic tang in my mouth, probably from fear or adrenaline. Back at home, I loaded the new photos. I felt my throat tighten when I saw the same faces again. They appeared in multiple windows, sometimes on the first floor, sometimes on the second. The woman's eyes were the same. The man's face was the same. No difference in their expressions. It was like they were frozen in place, just moving from window to window. My fingers trembled as I clicked through the pictures. I felt a wave of nausea, but I kept looking. I wanted some logical explanation. I wanted to see a glitch or a flaw in the glass. But these reflections looked too real. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. I showed the photos to a close friend who also does photography. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the screen and shook his head. He said he had no idea how I'd capture these images if there wasn't anyone inside. Then he asked if I'd actually seen any people when I was shooting. I told him no, of course not. He suggested I leave it alone. He said I might be messing with something I shouldn't. That made me uneasy, but I didn't believe in anything supernatural. I just believed in things that can be explained somehow. I decided to go back one more time to see if I could catch someone there. It was late afternoon again. The sun was low, and the house cast a long shadow across the field. I parked my car and walked quietly through the grass. I stayed near the trees, trying to watch the windows from a distance. I had binoculars with me. I watched the second floor windows for a while. I saw nothing. Then I moved around to the side of the mansion, checking more windows. Still nothing. I was sweating. My pulse felt fast. I noticed my hands were shaky. I took a few pictures from the distance, just in case. Eventually, I forced myself to step onto the porch and peer inside through a cracked window. The living room was dark. I couldn't see anything unusual. Then I heard a thump from somewhere upstairs. It was a single, heavy sound. I stood frozen. My heart pounded. I waited a few seconds, hoping to see something move inside. It stayed dark and still. My stomach felt tight. I decided I wasn't going in. I'd already tested my luck enough. I left and went home to check the pictures. The reflection was there again. This time it was the woman, in a window near the porch. She looked closer. I mean physically closer to the glass, like she was right against it. I could see the outline of her hair, the way it fell on her forehead. Her eyes were wide. My lungs felt like they couldn't expand fully. I closed all my files and sat there in silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. For a few days, I tried to ignore the whole thing. I worked on other assignments. I took photos of an old warehouse across town and tried to forget about the mansion. But at night, I kept picturing those faces, staring out from those windows. I kept feeling the chill on my neck like they were behind me. I didn't sleep well. I started triple-checking my apartment door before bed. My appetite dipped. I felt anxious all the time. I'd never been this on edge from a photo shoot in my life. I decided to store the mansion photos on an external drive. I moved them off my main computer, hoping that I wouldn't stumble across them, but I still thought about them. I started to wonder if I should contact the local historical society to see if there was a record of the owners or any events tied to the place. But a part of me just wanted to drop it. My friend's words stuck with me. Maybe I'm messing with something I shouldn't. I'm not a superstitious person, but I also don't want to keep poking at this. I never ended up returning to the mansion after that. My curiosity lost out to my gut feeling. To this day, whenever I drive anywhere near that area, I feel the hair on my arm stand up. I won't even glance in that direction. The photos are still on my external drive. I haven't deleted them, and I haven't shown them to anyone else. Every once in a while, I catch myself hovering the mouse over that folder, thinking about opening it. Then I feel my stomach churn, and I decide it's not worth it. That's my story. It still feels unreal. But I know what I saw in those pictures. I know those faces weren't there when I was looking through the lens. I know I was alone. Yet there they were, showing up in multiple shots, staring back at me with those blank expressions. They never moved or changed. They just watched. I can't explain it. I can only tell you that it scared me more than any crumbling staircase or squeaking door ever did. Now I stick to safer ruins, ones that don't have odd reflections or random thumps. And I don't plan on visiting that mansion again. It can stay there empty, with its faces pressed against the glass waiting for someone else to come by. I'm done with it, and that's enough for me. I never asked for this mansion, and I sure didn't expect to inherit it out of nowhere. I've been a real estate broker for a while, mostly dealing with modern condos and smaller properties. Old estates never interested me, so when the lawyer told me my great-uncle had left me his huge, worn-down home, I felt a mix of confusion and annoyance. Still, I drove out here, took one look at the sagging porch, the crooked shutters, and the overgrown yard, and decided I'd stay just long enough to fix it up and sell it. That was the plan. I had no idea how much my nights here would change everything I thought I knew about a quiet house. I got here on a Thursday afternoon. The place is set back from a dirt road, hidden behind gnarled trees and thick bushes. The front gate is rusted, and the driveway is cracked. I parked by the front steps and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment before heading in. I could tell the house hadn't been touched in decades. Dust coated the floors. The windows smelled stale. I felt a weird chill when I stepped inside. It wasn't cold outside, but I felt a breeze pass through the foyer like there was an open window somewhere. I checked around and didn't see anything. I tried not to overthink it. I set my bags down in what used to be the living room. The old furniture was covered in sheets. A grandfather clock stood next to the staircase, but it wasn't ticking. I lifted a corner of the sheet on the couch and saw water stains. I shrugged it off and decided to stay in a smaller bedroom near the back of the house to avoid the worst of the dust. I brought in a folding cot and some basic necessities. My plan was to tackle one room at a time, fix things up enough so the place could pass inspection. Then I'd list it at some inflated price and wait for someone to swoon over its old world charm. My first night was rough. The wind was howling outside, and the old walls creaked. I've been in creaky houses before, so it didn't really bother me. Around midnight, I woke up hungry and went to the kitchen to check if the fridge still worked. It didn't, so I settled for a bottle of water and some crackers from my bag. The floor felt cold under my feet. The overhead light flickered once or twice, but stayed on. I told myself the wiring was old. By 2 a.m., I was tossing and turning on my cot, unable to sleep. That was the first time I heard the conversations in the walls. It started as a faint murmur, something like two voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The voices sounded calm, like people talking about everyday stuff. Weather, chores, maybe errands. I felt my pulse speed up. My mouth went dry. I checked every inch of that room. There was no radio, no TV, no phone. Just my phone on the nightstand, and it was on silent mode. I put my hand on the wall and felt a light vibration. My heart pounded, and I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pipes or the wind. I tried to ignore it. Eventually, around 4 a.m, I dozed off. The next morning, I woke up later than I wanted. My phone's alarm didn't go off. I probably forgot to set it. I checked the time and realized I'd slept through half the morning. I showered in the cracked old bathroom. The hot water worked, but the water had a slight odor. After I got dressed, I decided to explore the house a bit. The walls looked normal in the daylight. I could see where the paint was peeling. Some panels were loose. I tapped one panel where I'd heard the voices, but I didn't hear anything. I made a mental note to check for old wiring or rodents. I spent most of that day clearing debris from the attic. I found boxes of my great-uncle's belongings. Old letters, documents, pictures. Nothing too interesting, just accounts of local events, some property records. I came across a stack of dusty pictures of this same house back when it was new. People in old-fashioned clothes stood on the porch, smiling stiffly for the camera. I threw everything back in the boxes. I felt a dull headache by mid-afternoon, probably dust or mold. I decided to take a break and go to the small town store for some supplies. I bought cleaning items, some basic groceries, and a few flashlights. I chatted with the store clerk briefly. She asked if I was staying at the old mansion on the hill. I said yes. She shook her head and warned me about possible structural hazards. I told her I'd be careful. On my way out, she patted my shoulder and told me to watch my step. Her tone was odd, but I didn't think too much about it. That second night, I set up a radio on the kitchen counter for some background noise, but the signal was terrible. I tried a local station. Static. I tried to ignore the emptiness of the place. I heated some canned soup on the stove. The gas worked, but the flame flickered a lot. After dinner, I walked around the house with a flashlight, checking loose floorboards. The sense of unease was still there, but I told myself it was just the isolation. It was after midnight when I got back to the small bedroom. My eyes felt heavy, but my mind wouldn't settle. I turned off the lamp and lay down on the cot. The house settled with groans and knocks. Then I heard the voices again, clearer this time. 2 distinct voices, one male, one female. They talked about me. I heard my name. My heart started to race. My hands felt clammy. I tried to control my breathing. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The male voice said something about tomorrow, and the female voice mentioned the attic ladder and broken rung. Then everything went quiet. I didn't sleep for hours. I just kept staring at the ceiling, replaying what I heard in my head. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I woke up in the morning with stiff shoulders and a pounding headache. I drank 2 cups of strong coffee before heading to the attic. My plan was to ignore the voices. They had to be in my mind or maybe some echo through the vents. But I remembered the phrase about a broken rung. I hadn't noticed a problem with the ladder. Still, I climbed up slowly. Halfway up, I felt the ladder give way under my foot. One rung snapped right off. I caught myself on the step above, panting, heart pounding in my throat. I could have fallen backward 6 feet onto a pile of old boxes. My arms shook. I climbed back down carefully, mind racing. The voices had predicted it. There was no other explanation. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but it left me uneasy. I spent the rest of the day checking the house for hazards. My hands were sweaty the whole time, and my mind kept replaying the words, broken rung. I patched up some cracks in the walls, replaced some old hinges, and avoided the attic. That evening, I kept the radio on low, but it didn't stop my thoughts. Around 10, I was fighting a headache and my stomach felt tight. I lay in bed staring at the dark. My body felt tense, my neck ached, and I couldn't get comfortable. Around midnight, the murmuring started again. I stayed on the cot, trying not to move. My pulse thudded in my ears. The female voice spoke first. She said something about the living room, about me moving furniture. The male voice laughed. It was a short, dry laugh. Then he said my name again. My scalp prickled and my breathing turned shallow. I forced myself to listen carefully. They talked about me tripping over something. They said I'd twist my ankle. I felt a trickle of sweat run down my temple. My mind went to the living room, to the heavy furniture there, to the broken coffee table leg I'd seen earlier. In the morning, I decided I wouldn't go near the living room. I focused on the kitchen walls, scraping off old paint and prepping it for a fresh coat. My hands shook a little each time I remembered the voices. After lunch, I forgot about the warning and carried a bucket of tools through the living room to get outside to my truck. Halfway through the room, I kicked one of the sheet-covered chairs. It slid across the floor and smashed into a small table behind it. The edge of the table caught the side of my ankle. I felt a sharp sting. I dropped the bucket and cursed. I hobbled out to the porch and sat on the steps, feeling my ankle throb. It wasn't broken, but it hurt bad. Sweat dotted my forehead. My breathing was ragged. The voices were right again. By that point, I was scared. I couldn't ignore it anymore. These conversations in the walls were predicting my accidents. I thought about leaving, but the mansion was my responsibility, and I was halfway through a bunch of repairs. I decided to stay, but be more vigilant. I told myself I'd avoid listening to those voices. I tried earplugs that night. Useless. I still heard them, muffled but clear enough. They talked about small stuff at first. Tools, nails, groceries. Then they mentioned me, said something about me finally noticing them. My legs twitched with nervous energy. I got out of bed and paced. Then I heard the female voice say, "He'll see the door tomorrow. He'll try to open it." The male voice responded, "He won't like what he finds." Then silence. I had no idea what door they meant. The house had a bunch of doors, bedrooms, closets, the cellar. I decided to search the next morning. My hands trembled as I opened every door in the house. I checked closets and storage rooms. Everything looked normal. By afternoon, I was exhausted. My ankles still hurt, and my nerves were on edge. The worst part was the quiet. The daytime had no voices. They only showed up at night. I almost wanted them to speak during the day so I could confront whatever was happening. That night, the tension made my skin crawl. I tried to read an old newspaper I'd found, but I couldn't focus on the words. I sat on the edge of my cot, tapping my foot. Around midnight, the walls started to whisper again. This time, the male voice said, "The basement door." The female voice replied, "He'll open it. He won't turn back." My mouth went dry. I'd only been in the basement once to check the fuse box. It was cramped and smelled musty. I remembered seeing a locked door down there. I hadn't tried to open it because I assumed it was a utility closet or some old storage room. The next day, I limped down to the basement with a hammer, a flashlight, and a screwdriver. The overhead bulb was dim. The floor was uneven concrete. My skin prickled at the damp air. I moved a stack of paint cans to see the locked door. It was made of heavy wood with chipped paint and a rusty lock. My heart beat faster as I knelt to inspect the lock. It looked old, probably easy to break. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. My rational mind told me it was just a basement door. The tension in my chest told me otherwise. I jammed a screwdriver into the lock and hit it with the hammer until the lock snapped. Then I pulled the door open. My flashlight revealed a narrow space filled with dusty shelves. There were no weird decorations or hidden passages, just a cramped storage area with boxes of old wires, rusted tools, and a few sacks of rock salt. I felt a weird mix of relief and confusion. I checked everything. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet I still felt watched. I left the door open and went upstairs, feeling uneasy. That night I expected the voices to talk about what I'd found. I stayed awake, reading a home improvement guide. Around 1 a.m, I heard them again. The male voice sounded frustrated. He said, "He found nothing. He thinks that's all." The female voice whispered, "He doesn't know how deep it goes." I felt my entire body tense. My throat constricted, and I realized I was holding my breath. I heard the male voice say, "We show him or we wait." The female voice answered, "We wait. He's not ready." Then silence. I tried to sleep, but my stomach churned. My skin felt clammy. I thought about the day's tasks, installing new light fixtures, patching holes. I wondered if there was another secret door, or maybe a hidden panel. The idea of searching the entire house from top to bottom made me feel dizzy. I forced myself out of bed at dawn. I ran a cold shower and stayed under the water until my teeth chattered. Then I put on my clothes, drank black coffee, and started tapping on the walls in the downstairs hallway. I moved a painting off one wall and found a loose section of paneling. My pulse quickened. I pried it open. Behind it was a small cavity with old wiring. Nothing else. I exhaled slowly. My hands were shaking, but I kept going, checking corners and floors. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and sweaty. I felt my ankles ache. My arms were sore from prying panels. I decided I'd had enough. I collapsed onto the dusty couch in the living room, ignoring the musty smell. I stared at the ceiling fan, which wasn't running because the wiring upstairs was still bad. I thought about the voices. Maybe they thrived on my fear. Maybe if I stopped reacting, they'd lose their hold. It was just a thought. I got up to make dinner. The kitchen was quiet, just the hum of the old stove. I ate a sandwich, then went back to my bedroom, leaving the hallway lights on. That night, the voices sounded agitated. The male voice said, "He's resisting. We have to show him." The female voice whispered, "Tomorrow will change his mind." My heart rate shot up and my hands clenched into fists. I felt a tingling in my arms. I tried to breathe slowly. I shut my eyes and tried to push the sound away. The voices went silent. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I walked the entire house, waiting for something horrible to happen. I expected a loose floorboard to collapse, or maybe a short circuit to spark a fire. Nothing happened. The day went smoothly. I replaced rotted window frames. I hammered new nails into the porch steps. I even ate lunch on the porch, feeling the warm air on my face. I almost believed that the voices were done. But as dusk fell, I felt a chill run down my back. The windows rattled slightly. I decided to wait out the night in the living room with a flashlight and my phone ready. The sky turned dark. The old house settled, making those strange sounds again. Around midnight, I heard them in the walls. They were angry. The male voice hissed, "He's ignoring us." The female voice said, "We force his hand. We show him." Then my phone buzzed. No calls, just the battery alert. I plugged it in, but the charger wouldn't work. The overhead light flickered. I felt the floor vibrate beneath me. I jumped up, heart racing. I ran to the main hallway. The entire house felt like it was humming, then it stopped. I waited, breathing hard. My limbs felt shaky. I looked around in silence, flashlight beam darting across the dusty floors. Nothing else happened. No big collapse, no sudden appearance. Just the sound of my own rapid breathing echoing off the walls. I stayed there, leaning against the banister, struggling to calm down. Eventually, I returned to my cot, feeling every muscle in my body ache. My head throbbed. I kept the flashlight on, shining it at the spot on the wall where I usually heard them. I muttered, "What do you want?" No answer. I felt drained, but I refused to lie down. My eyelids felt heavy. Then I heard the woman's voice right next to my ear, quiet but clear. "He's ready." I spun around, stumbling over the edge of the cot. There was nothing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I fumbled for my phone to call someone, anyone. No signal. My throat felt tight. I wanted to get out, but I couldn't leave. I felt anchored, like the house wouldn't let me go. So now I'm here, sitting on the edge of the cot. The sun is about to rise and I haven't slept. I don't know if the voices will ever stop. They predict things. They manipulate events in my day. I can't explain it. I can't ignore it. I only know that each time they speak, something happens. I keep trying to fix the house, but the more I fix, the more I realize there's something behind these walls that I can't fix with a hammer or nails. My ankle still hurts from that table, and my shoulders ache from all the tension. My nerves feel raw. I plan to make a call later today. I might hire a team to finish these renovations for me. Or maybe I'll look for an exorcist, even though I don't believe in that kind of thing. I just want this house off my hands. I want a normal life again. I don't want to hear those whispers in the night, predicting every stumble, every mistake, every piece of my day. But for now, I'm stuck in this place, listening to the walls, waiting for the next thing they'll say. And I don't know if I'll ever feel safe here again. I was in the basement of the old records building late on a Tuesday night. The air down there always felt thick, like it hadn't moved in decades. I'd been sent to catalog a series of file boxes that no one had touched in years. My boss told me to toss anything I considered worthless, but I hesitated to throw out records without taking a closer look. That's how I found the shoebox of cassette tapes. At first, I thought they were personal recordings of some former employee. Then I noticed a label on one tape with a date that hadn't happened yet. It read March 14, 2026, but the year was 2025. I held that tape in my hand for a long moment. My stomach tightened. I felt a rush of heat across my neck. I wanted to dismiss it as an error. I told myself that maybe someone had mislabeled it or made a joke. But I took the tape to the small office at the far end of the basement. I found an old cassette player there, covered in dust and grime. My hand shook a little when I opened the tape deck. The door squeaked and I slid the cassette inside. I pressed play, and I heard static. Then I heard a voice. It was my voice. I heard it say, "I'm standing in the corner of my living room trying to decide if I should answer the phone." The recording continued, describing a mundane event. It mentioned the exact brand of coffee I'd started drinking last week. It mentioned how I felt anxious about an upcoming presentation at work. The tape ended with a mention of a small power outage in my apartment complex. The voice said it would happen around 9 p.m. the next day. My mouth felt dry. My chest felt tight. I wondered if I was losing my mind. I looked around the small room, half expecting someone to jump out and tell me it was a prank. Nobody was there. It was just me, the cassette player, and those tapes. I ejected the tape, turned it over in my hands, and checked it again. The label still said March 14th, 2026, but that date was over a year away. I tried to brush it off and told myself the voice just sounded similar to mine. When I got home that night, I replayed what I had heard in my head. I fixed a quick dinner and sat in front of the TV, trying to ignore the anxiety that crept through my body. My mind kept going back to that tape. I ended up checking the time every few minutes as it got closer to 9 p.m. When the clock hit 9:03 p.m. and the lights were still on, I felt relieved. I even laughed a little, thinking I'd spooked myself for no reason. But at 9:07 p.m., the power cut out. It stayed out for about 10 seconds, then it snapped back on. I sat in my living room staring at the lights. My heart pounded and sweat formed on my forehead. The cassette had predicted this. It wasn't a huge blackout, just a flicker, but it matched the tape. I stood there with my hands shaking. I paced around my apartment for half an hour, trying to come up with a rational explanation. I told myself maybe it was a coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the timing. The next morning, I went back to the basement. I tried to focus on my regular tasks, but my eyes kept drifting toward that shoebox. I decided to check the other cassettes. Most of them had dates that were months or years from now. Some had no dates at all, just short phrases on the labels. One said, "The meeting." Another said, "The car." Another read, "The leak." They were all in my handwriting, though I had no memory of making these labels. I felt a tremor in my chest that moved up to my throat. My lips went dry and I pressed them together. I took a second tape, labeled "The meeting," and put it in the player. I heard my voice again. It mentioned something about a meeting with the head of the archives department. It talked about the way I'd be assigned a new project. Then I heard specific details: my boss's outfit, the time of day, the frustration I'd feel. The tape ended with my own voice saying, "I walk out of that room knowing I can't escape this situation." The hairs on my arms stood up when I heard myself say that. I checked the small basement clock on the wall. It was almost noon. My boss had told me earlier that she wanted to see me at 1 p.m. to talk about next quarter's plans. I felt my throat tighten and I started to sweat again. I told myself to ignore the tape and see what would actually happen. At 12:50 p.m., I headed upstairs to her office. My chest felt hollow and my ears were ringing. The meeting started exactly at 1 p.m. She wore a gray blazer, just like the tape described. She told me the archivist department was restructuring. I'd be taking on a more demanding role. She used the phrase, "new project." My palms were wet against the arms of the chair. Every detail lined up with the tape. The meeting ended, and I walked out feeling cornered and exhausted, just like the tape said. I returned to the basement after that. The lights in the corridor flickered, and I found myself glancing around, wondering if I was being watched. My back tensed as I pushed open the heavy metal door. The shoebox was still on the desk where I'd left it. I wanted to toss those tapes in the trash, but I needed to know more. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, but I played another tape. This one had no label except the word "work" scrawled in black marker. I heard my voice describing events that would happen over the next few days. It mentioned a small argument with a coworker about mislabeled files. It mentioned that I'd burn my hand on the coffee machine. It mentioned that I'd find a hidden corridor in the basement that led to a storage area I never knew existed. My breath caught in my throat at that last part. I didn't think there was any hidden corridor down here. But the tape said I'd trip on a loose tile and push against the wall at the end of the room. It would swing open to reveal an older section of the basement. I shook my head, not wanting to believe it. The next day, I was reorganizing old folders when a coworker came down. He said one of my boxes was mislabeled and he was annoyed because it set back his inventory. We argued for a few minutes, then he left. It was a small confrontation, but it matched the tape. I tried to stay calm, but I felt myself shaking. Later that same day, I stopped by the break room to make coffee. The machine splashed hot water on my left hand, and I jerked back, muttering curses under my breath. My hand stung and I ran it under cold water, thinking about the tape's words. I was so tense I had trouble focusing on the simplest tasks. That afternoon, I was carrying a stack of binders across the basement. I tripped on a loose tile, almost dropping the binders. I reached out to steady myself and my palm pressed against a section of the far wall. I heard a faint click and the wall moved about 2 inches. My heart jumped into my throat. I pushed again and the wall pivoted on hidden hinges. A musty smell rushed out from the darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf and shined it into the space. I saw rows of crates and stacked boxes in a chamber that looked older than the rest of the basement. My breath was shaky as I stepped inside. My flashlight beam flickered over decaying cardboard, rusted metal shelves, and piles of old records. I also saw a small desk in the corner with a broken chair next to it. That desk had a cassette player on top of it. It was a different model than the one I'd been using, but it was dusty and obviously old. I walked over and nudged the chair aside with my foot. I felt a tightness in my chest as I picked up the cassette player. The power cord was frayed. Next to it, I saw a pile of unlabeled tapes. They were the same brand as the ones I'd found in the shoebox. I felt a jolt of adrenaline course through me. My head felt light, and my breathing got shallow. I didn't know what I'd uncover if I stayed there. My legs felt weak, and I ended up leaving the secret room. I pulled the hidden door shut behind me, my hands trembling against the cold metal. I sat at my usual desk, trying to calm down. The events described on the tapes had all happened. I couldn't deny it anymore. My voice on those recordings was real. It predicted my future. I felt my heart pounding as I considered what that meant for my life. I rummaged through the shoebox and counted the tapes. There were 20 in total. Most were labeled with dates or cryptic words. Some of the dates were only a few weeks away, others were months away, and a few were more than a year into the future. One tape had today's date on it. I pulled it out and saw the label "Today." My head throbbed as I slid it into the cassette player. I braced myself for whatever I'd hear. My voice came through the static. It said, "I'm standing in the basement at around 5 in the afternoon, too scared to open the next door. I keep checking the corridor to make sure I'm alone. I feel my heart pounding." I listened to the recording of myself describing these exact actions. I realize I can't avoid the next step. I paused the tape. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:55 p.m. My chest felt like it was vibrating. I pressed play again, clenching my teeth. The voice said, "I know I can't throw these tapes away. I'll try to figure out who made them or why they exist, but I'm afraid of what I'll discover next." That was the end. I stood there in silence. My mouth went dry and I felt the blood pounding in my temples. I wrapped the tapes in an old newspaper, grabbed the cassette player, and stuffed everything into my duffel bag. I checked the corridor outside. It was empty. I hurried up the stairs and left the building. On the drive home, I kept glancing at the bag on the passenger seat. I felt the tension in my shoulders. My jaw was clenched so tight that it ached. I kept telling myself to focus on the road, but my mind replayed every word of my own recorded voice. When I got home, I locked my door and double-checked my windows. I sat at the kitchen table with the cassette player in front of me. I wanted to listen to every tape, but I also wanted to leave them in a trash bin somewhere far away. I couldn't shake the feeling that once I heard them, I'd be trapped by whatever future they described. My hands were shaking and sweat dripped down my temples. I reached out, grabbed another tape labeled "Next Week," and slid it into the machine. The sound crackled. My voice started describing a situation at the grocery store. It said I'd run into an old friend from college. It said we'd end up discussing a problem with the archive building's foundation. I listened to every detail, my pulse racing. It mentioned a small crack in the floor near my desk. The tape ended with the words, "I realize these tapes are controlling me, but I can't stop listening." I snapped the player off. My breathing was shallow. I tried to fight the urge to keep going, but I felt drawn to the tapes. It was like I needed to know more about what was coming. Over the next few days, I tested the predictions. The grocery store event happened exactly as the tape said. The friend I hadn't seen in years recognized me. He asked about my job. He mentioned structural problems in old buildings. I stood there in the cereal aisle, my heart hammering. My hands felt sweaty on the cart handle. This kept happening with each tape. Every single detail came true. I started losing sleep. I'd wake up at night, my heart pounding, expecting to hear my own voice in the darkness. At work, I jumped at small noises in the basement, half convinced someone was watching me. I thought about telling someone else, but I couldn't imagine how they'd react. The tapes kept piling up in my apartment. I played each one in secret. My voice described conversations with coworkers, random events in the city, and small personal habits I hadn't formed yet but soon found myself doing. Now I'm sitting here, describing everything that's happened so far. I know there are tapes that go far beyond next month. I can't bring myself to play them all at once. I feel my legs shaking under the table. My hands feel cold. I keep looking at the cassette labeled 1 year from now. I'm too scared to press play, but I also can't throw it away. Part of me wants to understand how these tapes exist. Part of me worries that if I don't listen, I'll miss something important. My heart won't stop thumping in my chest as I stare at the pile of cassettes. I plan to go back to that secret room in the basement tomorrow. I want to see if there's any clue about who recorded these tapes. Maybe I'll find a piece of paper, a photograph, or some evidence that explains how my voice is on them. My stomach churns at the thought of going back down there, but I can't avoid it. The tapes describe my own future and they keep getting it right. It's like they have a grip on my life that I can't break. I keep replaying that first tape in my mind. Hearing my own voice talk about an event that hadn't happened yet felt impossible. But then the event happened exactly as described, just a few hours later. Every time I think I might be able to walk away from all this, something else lines up with the tapes. It's not a dream. It's not a prank. I hear my own voice and it's always correct about what's going to happen. I can't brush it off. I'm trapped in this pattern. My heart is pounding as I finish telling this story. I'm looking at the cassette player on my right. I'm looking at the stack of tapes on my left. I feel sweat collecting on my forehead. I just checked my apartment's windows again. They're locked. The next tape I plan to listen to is labeled Tomorrow Night. Maybe it will tell me I'll make a breakthrough. Maybe it will describe something I don't want to face. I don't see a way out. All I can do is press play, listen to my own voice, and wait for the events to unfold. My life hasn't been the same since I found those tapes, and I know it never will be again. I felt a knot in my stomach the moment I stood on the concrete edge of the dam. I had done this job hundreds of times before. I'd arrive early, check my gear, talk to the supervisor, and get in the water. It was always straightforward. But that morning, the water looked darker. It was the same shade of murky green it always had, but something about it made me uneasy. I glanced at my oxygen tanks, tested my regulator, and wiped sweat off my forehead. I told myself I was just tired from a poor night's sleep. That explanation didn't make the feeling go away, though. I forced a deep breath, tugged on my mask straps, and gave the signal to the crew member watching me. Then I slid into the water. I remember the cold hitting my face first. It made my skin tighten. My heartbeat thumped hard in my ears, but that happens every time I slip under. I'd always liked that initial shock because it kept me alert. Usually I'd settle into a steady breathing rhythm once I got deeper. My flashlight cut through the gloom in front of me as I descended along the dam's concrete wall. There was algae in thin patches near the surface, but most of the wall was smooth where I was working. I reached the 30-foot mark. My plan was to inspect a crack that had been reported during a previous survey. I checked my watch, checked my depth gauge, then kicked toward the spot. My breathing steadied, and the hiss of air moving in and out of the regulator replaced my earlier anxiety. That's when I heard it for the first time. A faint melody drifted through the water. It sounded like an old recording. The volume was low, but I could hear brass instruments. It reminded me of some vintage radio tune people might have heard in the 1930s or 1940s. I shook my head and checked my comm line, thinking maybe someone topside was playing music near the microphone. The line was clear. Nobody was saying anything. I tapped my ear, thinking maybe I had water in there causing some distortion. The tune still floated in the background. I tried to ignore it. I had a job to do, and I figured maybe my mind was playing a trick on me. I approached the cracked section of concrete, positioned my flashlight, and began my inspection. The crack wasn't too big, maybe a few inches wide, running vertically. I rubbed a finger along its edge. It felt rough. Probably needed a patch job. I reached down to grab my camera from the tool belt, As I raised it toward the crack, I noticed the music was getting louder. It wasn't blaring, but it seemed closer. I heard the trumpets and a steady drum pattern. The water around me vibrated with that old-timey quality, like a record with slight static. My lungs tightened. My pulse kicked up a notch. I wanted to believe it was just in my head, but the sound felt too real. I looked around with my flashlight. There was nothing there except the mottled gray of the concrete and the swirling particles of debris in the water. I took a few pictures of the crack, focusing on the job. Then I pushed off the wall to investigate another area. As I swam, the music kept playing in my ears, but it shifted in and out, like a weak radio station with poor reception. I tried tapping my helmet again. Nothing changed. I moved to the next section of the wall, ignoring the tension in my gut. I pointed my camera at some bolts that sometimes rust. I snapped a few shots. That's when I felt something tap against my mask. It was a gentle knock, like someone rapping on a window. I jerked my head back and blinked. I looked at the inside of my mask and saw a damp handprint. It was right in front of my eyes. On the inside, I froze. My heart hammered, and my breathing got ragged. I lifted my hand to wipe it away, but before I touched the glass, the print vanished. I could still see a faint smudge like condensation, but it was fading. My chest felt tight, and I tasted bitter adrenaline in my mouth. I looked around me with wide eyes. My flashlight beam shook from how tense my arm had become. There was nothing out there. No diver, no fish, no drifting piece of trash that could explain that. I wanted to surface right away, but I was also worried the guys up top would think I was losing it. I'd always been the steady one. I'd been diving for a decade, never had a panic attack, never had any weird incidents. I figured I might have rubbed my face or something without noticing. Still, it didn't feel right. I swam around the next corner of the wall, checking for more cracks. My watch told me I'd been underwater for 10 minutes. The music was still there, sometimes loud, sometimes fading. It was some kind of swing tune with horns and a steady snare drum. It drifted from every direction. My arms and legs felt heavier than usual. My breath was uneven. The regulator hissed with each inhale and exhale. After a few more minutes of moving along the wall, I decided to signal the surface. I needed a break. I didn't want to say on the comm line, "I'm hearing music and seeing handprints in my mask." But I told the surface crew I needed to check something topside. They acknowledged, and I slowly ascended, making sure not to move too fast. My safety stops felt like they dragged on, but I wasn't going to skip them. I stared into the dark water around me. The music dimmed as I went higher, but I could still pick up the faint sound in the distance. When I broke the surface, the sunlight felt harsh. My coworker, Tony, looked at me with concern. He asked if I was okay. I nodded and removed my mask. I told him I had some condensation issues and wanted to see if my comm line was picking up stray signals. He shook his head and said they hadn't heard anything unusual. He asked if I wanted to switch out or take a break. I said I was fine, just needed a minute. I walked a few steps away, took off my gear, and inspected my mask. I looked for cracks or any sign of damage. Everything looked normal. No weird prints on the inside. The faceplate was clean. My gloves were fine. I rubbed my eyes and drank some water. My face felt hot even though I was out of the cold water. I thought about telling Tony what was happening, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I said I'd give it another try. He shrugged and told me to be careful. I put my mask back on, checked my seals, and went back under. This time I tried to focus on the dam's structure. I turned on my flashlight and made my way to the base near the outflow. I was supposed to check the grates and see if there was any debris. My depth gauge read around 40 feet once I reached the lower portion. The water was colder down there, and my breathing echoed in my head. The old music came back, still playing in that distant way. It felt more intense now, like it was surrounding me. My arms trembled and I gripped the outflow grate. The metal was slick, covered in a thin film of algae. I tried to pull myself together. Then, as I turned my head to check the bolts, I noticed a shape moving off to the side. I swung my flashlight toward it. I saw nothing. No fish, no drifting cloth. just empty water. But that fleeting motion made my muscles tighten even more. My heart pounded in my chest, and I squeezed my regulator mouthpiece with my teeth. I tried to finish my inspection as quickly as possible. I was snapping photos of the grate, shining the beam of my flashlight along the edges. Then something brushed against my shoulder. It felt like a light touch, almost a hand resting there. I whipped around with my flashlight. Again, nothing. The music got louder. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. I moved away from the grate, heading back toward the wall. I felt a slight vibration in the water. My eardrums throbbed. The music seemed to shift into a slower tune, still old-fashioned, with the singer's voice drifting in and out. The words were muffled, impossible to make out, but the tone was calm and drawn out. I thought about turning around and making an immediate ascent, but my job required a full circuit around that section of the dam before finishing. I told myself to stick to the plan, get the photos, and get out. I pushed forward, scanning the wall. My flashlight illuminated a few cracks. My camera recorded them. My breathing was still off, my hand shook. Then, right as I was about to move to the final portion of the wall, I saw a fresh handprint on the inside of my mask. It was clearer this time. I could see the outline of fingers, the palm, and even the tiny lines that creased where a thumb might bend. It looked too detailed to be my glove or some random smudge. My stomach churned. I wanted to shout, but I only managed a strangled gasp into my regulator. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second and shook my head. When I opened them, the handprint was still there. My mouth felt dry despite the regulator. My heartbeat felt like it was thumping in my throat. Then the print began to fade, like moisture evaporating. I raised my hand to wipe it off. I felt the smooth glass. My fingertips brushed the surface, and the print vanished completely. The music kept playing, and I could hear faint static, like an old radio losing its station. I turned to head back up. I signaled the surface that I was coming in early. I didn't care if they questioned me about it. The supervisor's voice crackled in my ear, asking if everything was okay. I said I was just feeling a little off and needed to come up. They told me to take my time and ascend safely. I climbed the water column, careful to do my stops. The music stayed with me up until about 20 feet, then it slowly faded. By the time I breached the surface, I couldn't hear it anymore. Tony and another guy reached down to help me onto the platform. They asked if something had gone wrong with my gear. I shook my head. My face must have looked pale, because Tony got concerned and asked if I needed to sit down. I nodded and sat on the edge, removing my mask and regulator. My chest felt tight. I was breathing hard. I avoided eye contact with them because I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. Tony asked if I'd heard or seen anything weird. I paused. I finally admitted I'd been hearing something that sounded like old music and that I saw strange prints on my mask. Tony stared at me, then asked if I was messing with him. I told him no. He frowned and said we'd do a full check of my equipment. He thought maybe I had some condensation or a weird reflection. As for the music, he guessed it could have been interference on the comm, or maybe a boat passing nearby playing old songs. I knew it wasn't that, but I just nodded. I didn't argue. We checked my mask, regulator, and comm line. Everything looked normal. No cracks, no leaks, no sign of malfunction. I sat there for a while, trying to steady my pulse. My skin felt clammy, and I noticed goosebumps on my arms. The tension in my neck and shoulders wouldn't go away. Tony said if I wanted to call it a day, he could finish the job or we could bring in someone else. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but I didn't want rumors going around that I was scared of the water. I've always taken pride in my reliability. After a short break, I decided to try one more quick dive, just to check a couple of last details so I could say I completed my assignment. Tony told me to be careful, and I went under again, forcing my breath to slow. I descended only about 15 feet this time, not going as deep. I stayed near the top portion of the dam, scanning for anything obvious. The water was still dark, but there was a bit more light from above. I took a few photos of the top region's joints and seals. I listened carefully for the music. I only heard the hiss of my regulator and the faint rush of water. No horns, no singing. It felt like maybe everything was back to normal. I was about to finish up when I saw a flash of movement to my right. I turned, and in the distance I thought I saw a faint shape drifting. It disappeared as soon as I moved my flashlight beam toward it. I felt my scalp prickle. My heart rate soared again. I glanced at the inside of my mask. I didn't see any new prints, but I couldn't shake the dread in my gut. I signaled I was returning to the surface and moved up slowly. When I reached the top, I told Tony I was done. He didn't protest. My breathing was shaky, and my arms felt weak. I climbed out and removed my gear. Another coworker walked over to ask how it went. I just shrugged. I didn't want to say much. I pulled off my wetsuit top and dried my face with a towel. My head pounded. The tension in my muscles made me feel stiff and restless at the same time. I packed my equipment, got into my truck, and drove away from the site. The entire ride home, I kept glancing at my mask in the passenger seat. I almost expected to see a handprint appear on the glass or hear that old music on the radio. Nothing happened, but my nerves were shot. When I got home, I took a shower, but I still felt cold. I kept thinking about that melody and how it made my skin crawl. I remembered the handprint, the shape I glimpsed in the water, and the brush on my shoulder that felt human. The next day, I reported my findings to my supervisor. He listened to my story and looked puzzled. He said there was no explanation for the music or the handprints. We both knew random sounds can transmit underwater, especially around old structures with echoing tunnels. He suggested I take a few days off, see if I felt better. I agreed, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion. I felt uneasy the entire time I was away from the dam. It was like I'd left something unresolved. I kept waiting for my phone to ring with questions about the job. It never did. People said everything looked fine in the photos and the repair team could handle the cracks. Nobody else reported hearing music. Nobody else found handprints. I still do my job. I still dive for dam maintenance and other underwater projects. But I haven't gone back to that exact dam since. I told my boss I don't want that assignment anymore. He gave me a strange look, but didn't push it. Occasionally I'll sit alone at home and swear I hear a few notes of those old horns in the distance just for a second, before it disappears. It's always faint, like a radio that isn't tuned in properly. I can't explain what I experienced in the water that day. I only know what I felt and what I saw. I'm not a superstitious person. I check my gear, follow safety protocols, and pay attention to the environment. But none of that helped me when the music started. None of it explained the handprints or that touch on my shoulder. I know what I heard and what I felt. It still unsettles me. I think about it every time I prepare for a dive, and I can't forget the echo of that antique melody drifting through the cold, dark water. I started my shift at the hotel with a quick look at my watch. 11 p.m. on the dot. The lobby was quiet. That was normal for a Tuesday night. I stood by the front doors, nodded at a guest who passed me on his way out, and took a moment to stretch my arms. My name's Joe, and I've been the night doorman here for almost 4 years. Usually my biggest problems are drunk guests, missing room keys, and the occasional argument in the lobby. Everything else follows a routine. But a few nights ago, something changed. I began to notice the elevator acting strange around the early hours. At first I thought I was imagining things. Then it happened enough times for me to be sure. The elevator was stopping on a floor that didn't exist. I'll start from the first night I noticed it. It was around 2 a.m. I was in my usual spot near the front desk, just standing there, watching the empty lobby. I happened to glance at the elevator's digital panel above the doors. The numbers blinked in sequence as the elevator went from floor to floor, dropping someone off or maybe carrying them up. Then it happened. The panel showed 13 for a split second before going dark. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. The hotel has 12 floors. There's no 13th floor listed. The owners are superstitious, so they skipped that number. I'm not a big believer in stuff like that, but I know a lot of older buildings do the same thing, so that was a red flag right away. I walked over to the elevator and pressed the button. When the doors slid open, it was empty. The interior light was normal. I stood there for a moment, kind of puzzled. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 12th floor, and rode it up. The ride was smooth. I got off on 12, walked around the hallway, and everything looked fine. I didn't see anyone. The hallway lights were on, the carpet was clean, and the vending machine in the corner hummed like usual. Nothing was out of place. I went back to the elevator, wrote it down, and told myself maybe I'd misread the panel. On the second night, I kept my eye on the elevator's panel every time it moved. I leaned against the front desk, arms crossed, watching those glowing numbers go up and down. People came and went. Around midnight, the bar crowd from the lounge on the ground floor headed out. A few folks returned to their rooms a bit tipsy. Then around 1:30 a.m., the elevator numbers on the panel cycled up to 12, paused, then flickered. It showed 13 for maybe half a second, then went blank. My heartbeat sped up. I felt this jump in my stomach, like I'd caught a quick drop on a roller coaster. I walked straight to the elevator again. The doors opened by themselves as if someone inside had pressed the lobby button, but nobody was there. The next night I wanted to see more. I decided to test it. Around 2 a.m., when the lobby was dead, I stepped into the elevator and pressed each floor button one by one, just to see if there was any glitch. Nothing happened. It stopped at each floor from 2 through 12, and then came back down. I checked the panel on every trip. No errors. By 3 a.m., I was certain it was just some glitch that happened at random times. I planned to forget about it. But then, as I was stepping out of the elevator into the lobby, the doors closed behind me, and I saw that panel display 13 again through the narrow gap. It showed up for a second, then disappeared. The elevator went up without me. I felt my muscles tense. My hands started to sweat. I jabbed the call button. The elevator came back, empty, as usual. I got in. My heart was pounding, but I needed to see for myself what was happening. I pressed the button for 12, then I waited. The elevator rose, passing floors 2, 3, 4 all the way up. At 12 it stopped. The door stayed closed. The panel above the door inside the cabin flickered. It jumped from 12 to 13. Then the doors slid open. I stared at the hallway. It was dim. The walls seemed off, like they'd shifted a bit, creating a subtle tilt. The carpet looked frayed. The smell in the air reminded me of stale cigarette smoke and old, wet fabric. My heart was thumping so hard that I felt a headache coming on. I stepped out just 1 foot into the hallway. The air felt thick. The lights overhead buzzed, and one of them sputtered. There were doors along the corridor, just like on any other floor, but they looked dusty. The door handles seemed tarnished. I swallowed, and my throat felt dry. My hands trembled a little, so I clenched my fists to steady them. I felt like turning around, but my curiosity pulled me forward. I reached for the nearest door handle, but it didn't move. It was locked. I started to move along the hallway, one careful step at a time, checking each door. They were all locked. The place was quiet except for that faint buzzing. I could also hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I walked about halfway down the hallway and noticed a flicker of movement near the far end. It might have been a shadow or a reflection. My stomach tightened. I rubbed my eyes to clear them, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. I glanced back at the elevator. The door was still open, as if waiting. Something in my gut told me to go back. I turned around, hurried to the elevator, and stepped inside. I pressed the lobby button. It closed with a smooth swish, and the digital panel above the door blinked once. Then it went from 13 to 12 down to 1, then the lobby. The door opened to the normal, quiet ground floor. The lights were bright. The air felt different, almost refreshing. I walked out. My pulse was racing. I didn't say anything to anyone, because nobody else was there except the front desk clerk who was dozing behind the counter. The next night, I tried to ignore what I'd seen. I told myself I must have been tired. But by 1 a.m. I could feel this tension in my chest, waiting for the elevator to display that forbidden floor again. I drank coffee to stay alert. My eyes kept flicking to the panel whenever someone used the elevator. Around 2:15, I saw it again. The numbers rose to 12, stayed there, then flickered to 13 for a beat and vanished. I clenched my teeth. I walked over and pressed the button, empty as always. I stepped inside. My head felt light, but I pressed 12. The same sequence happened. The elevator reached 12, paused, and then it opened onto that corridor. This time I forced myself to walk a bit farther. The doors behind me stayed open for a few seconds, then they slid shut without me pressing anything. That rattled me, but I kept going. My stomach churned. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my face. Each door looked the same as before. Old, tarnished doorknobs, chipped paint. The overhead lights buzzed. I heard a hum in the walls. It might have been the ventilation, but it sounded off. I breathed in and out, trying to keep calm. My legs felt stiff. I placed my hand on one of the doors, trying to push it open again. It clicked, but didn't budge. I heard a dull thud from somewhere in front of me. I froze. My palms were damp. My heart started hammering in my ears. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. I took a step forward. The carpet felt soft under my shoes, like it was padded with something thick. The air smelled musty. I could almost taste the dust on my tongue. Another thud came, a bit closer. I wiped my hands on my pants, took a few more steps, and turned the corner. There was a short side hallway leading to a door marked with a dark metal plate. It had no numbers. I thought maybe it was a storage closet. I stood there, about 6 feet away, watching it. My breath sounded louder than usual. My hands started to shake again. I stepped forward and reached for the handle. It was cold and slick, like metal that hadn't been touched for a long time. The door groaned when I pushed it. Inside, there was a small room with a single light bulb in the ceiling. The walls were lined with old wallpaper peeling around the edges. The smell in there was stale, like dirty laundry left in a closed bag. There was a table in the middle of the room with a few chairs. The table's surface was dusty. One chair was pulled out. I walked around it. The floor creaked. I saw footprints in the dust. They didn't match my shoes. I bent down to get a closer look, but they were faded. They led to a corner and just stopped. I felt a surge of nerves run from my chest to my throat. I backed out of the room, closed the door, and hurried down the corridor, trying to find the elevator. The hallway seemed longer than before. The lights flickered, and I felt a rise in my pulse. Finally, I spotted the elevator doors at the far end. They were closed. My steps grew faster. I jammed my finger on the call button. My ears rang with the silence around me. The doors opened. I darted inside and pressed the lobby button. My hands were shaking so much that I almost pressed something else by accident. The panel blinked from 13 to 12, then kept going down until the doors opened onto the lobby. I stumbled out. The normal lights and clean carpet welcomed me, and I felt my legs relax. I wiped my forehead with my sleeve. I checked around me to see if anyone had noticed. The front desk clerk was engrossed in the computer. A guest sat in one of the lobby chairs, scrolling through something on a phone. No one looked at me. I stepped into the staff restroom, locked the door, and splashed water on my face. My reflection in the mirror was pale. My eyes were wide. My shirt was damp under my arms. I leaned against the sink, breathing hard. Eventually, I calmed down enough to return to the lobby. That same night, around 3:30 a.m., I saw the elevator's panel flash again. This time, I stood still. I didn't chase it. I waited. The elevator came down to the lobby, paused, then the doors slid open by themselves. I stared at the empty cabin. My heart thumped in my chest. I wasn't about to do another trip without a plan. I left it alone. It stayed open for several seconds, then it closed, and the numbers on the panel returned to normal. Over the next few nights, the same thing kept happening around 2 or 3 in the morning. The panel would flicker at 12, switch to 13, and open onto that distorted hallway. I ventured in 2 more times, but always briefly. I noticed more details each time. The smell was worse in some spots. The ceiling in one section dripped a bit of water onto the floor, and the paint on the walls looked bubbled. I never saw another person. I heard sounds sometimes. A scrape across the floor or a faint bang in the distance. My pulse would jump each time. My limbs felt hot, like adrenaline was coursing through me. I couldn't shake this dread whenever I stepped in there. One night I told the front desk clerk, Jared, that I suspected the elevator had a short or some mechanical glitch. I said I heard weird noises. He shrugged and said we'd have to report it to maintenance, but we both knew that building management took a long time to fix issues that didn't cause immediate problems for guests. When the elevator was used by regular people, it worked fine and never showed 13. It only happened when the building was quiet. Jared didn't seem interested in doing anything about it. He had his own tasks, plus he rarely left the desk at night. I started to dread going anywhere near the elevator after 1 a.m. I kept busy by doing small cleaning chores around the lobby and near the entrance. I wiped down the windows, stacked flyers on the desk, and organized the lost and found drawer. But in the back of my mind, I was always aware of that elevator. At some point in the night, it was going to flash 13. I could feel a tightness in my shoulders whenever I thought about it. My legs felt tense. My lower back ached from standing in one place for too long. Last night was the worst so far. It was around 2:45 a.m. The panel showed 12, flickered, then hit 13. I decided I needed some sort of proof. I took my phone out, readied the camera, and stepped into the elevator. I pressed 12. When the doors opened to that hallway, I started recording. My phone's light illuminated the walls. I walked slowly, feeling the tightness in my chest. I passed a few doors, each locked. I walked until I reached that side corridor again. The door with no numbers was there, same as before. I saw those footprints leading into the corner of the small room, still faded, still ending without explanation. A dull scrape echoed behind me. My ears popped with the rush of my heartbeat. I spun around, phone in hand, but I only caught the edge of the corridor. There was nothing in sight. I whispered a few curses under my breath. I turned the camera toward the door, the hallway, and everything around me. My mouth felt dry. My scalp tingled. That sense of being watched nagged at me even though I saw no one there. I backed away, phone shaking in my hand. When I returned to the elevator, the doors were shut. I pressed the call button and saw the light blink. It felt like the wait took forever. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to come around the corner. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The doors finally slid open, and I jumped inside. I slapped the lobby button. The digital panel flicked from 13 to 12, then quickly descended. When it opened onto the lobby, I almost fell out. I rushed to the front desk and checked my phone screen. The video was full of static. The audio track captured some strange popping and crackling, but nothing else. I couldn't see the hallway. It was just darkness and flickers of distorted pixels. My hand trembled as I locked my phone and stuffed it into my pocket. I felt a wave of nausea in my stomach. I stood behind the desk for the rest of the shift, not talking to anyone, just staring at the elevator from time to time. It didn't stop at 13 again that night. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I left the building as quickly as I could. I haven't told anyone else about what I saw because I don't think they'd believe me. They'd say I'm stressed or that I'm pranking them. But I know it's real. I've felt the thick air in that hallway. I've smelled the stale odor on my clothes afterward. I've heard those knocks and scrapes. I've seen the warped walls, flickering lights, and locked doors. I don't plan to step foot there again unless I have to. But in my job, I might not have a choice. If I see the elevator go to 13, I'm going to stand there in the lobby and pretend I don't notice. That's my plan for now. I'm just trying to keep myself calm and get through my shift. That's all I can do. If the elevator calls, I'm going to ignore it. I don't want to see that place anymore. I don't know what's in there, and I'm not sure I want to find out. The first time I noticed the problem, I felt a jolt in my stomach that made me stop what I was doing and stare at the clock on my workbench. It was 3:33 in the morning. All the other clocks in my workshop had stopped too. They sat there with their hands stuck in that same position, as if someone had pressed a giant pause button across every device in the room. The second hands didn't budge. I blinked a few times and waited for something to move, but everything remained frozen. My skin prickled, and I felt a dampness on my forehead. I wiped the sweat away with the back of my hand. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I'm a watchmaker. I repair clocks, I fix wrists watches, and I build custom pieces. Most of my clients bring me old clocks they found in their grandparents' attics or stopwatches that have sentimental value. I've spent years listening to the rhythmic ticking in my workshop while I work through the night, mostly because I enjoy the quiet. That night I was trying to finish a restoration project for a customer who wanted it done by the weekend. I had taken a break to stretch my legs and get some water, and when I came back I checked the time on the large grandfather clock near the door. It read 3:33. Then I looked at the wall clock on my left. It also read 3:33. At first I thought it was a coincidence. Then I glanced at the vintage pocket watch on my workbench and saw the same time. My stomach clenched. I reached for a small digital clock I sometimes keep in a drawer for accuracy checks. I turned it on, and the screen lit up. It showed 3:33. I felt a chill on my neck, so I looked behind me. No one was there. The air felt thick. I heard my own breathing, rough and uneven. I placed the digital clock next to me. I tapped it a few times and it didn't change. I listened for any ticks or mechanical sounds from the other clocks in the room. I heard nothing. It was complete silence, as if the workshop was sealed in a bubble. Even the usual hum from the old fridge in the corner seemed gone. I turned around in a slow circle, checking each clock. Every dial showed the exact same moment, and nothing moved forward. The workshop looked normal under the overhead lights. Tools were spread out across my main bench. Small screwdrivers, tweezers, cotton gloves, a polishing cloth, and a few clock gears. I saw my metal stool, my half-finished mug of coffee, and my open toolbox. Nothing else seemed strange, but I couldn't ignore the time. I felt my chest tighten. My mouth went dry. I waited for something to happen. My eyes darted around, trying to catch any sign of movement. That was when I noticed a shift in the corner of my vision near the shelf of old clocks I keep for spare parts. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't a shadow cast by anything I recognized. It moved between the clocks, sliding from one edge of the shelf to the other. It looked dark and shapeless, but it had a texture like smoke twisting in the air. I froze. My legs felt weak, but I forced them to move closer to that corner. I wanted to see if I was losing my mind. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. When I reached the shelf, the shape was gone. I stood there scanning the space between the clocks, trying to find a sign of movement. But I saw nothing. I could feel a slight tremor in my hands. The air around me felt colder now. I turned back to check the clocks again. Still 3:33. I didn't understand how every single piece could stop at the exact same time. Even broken clocks usually show different hours. Then I heard a soft whisper, like someone mumbling under their breath. I spun around and faced the far side of the workshop, near my storeroom door. I didn't see anyone, but the whispering continued. It was too faint to make out words. My breath came in quick bursts, and I could sense my heartbeat in my fingertips. I took a few steps toward the storeroom. The whispering grew a little louder, but I still couldn't tell what it was saying. Then it stopped. I stood there wondering if I should turn off the lights and search the place. I decided against it. I didn't want to be in the dark with whatever that was. I already felt cornered. I hurried to the front of the workshop, unlocked the door, and stepped outside. I took a few deep breaths of the night air. It was cool on my face, and it smelled of wet pavement and distant traffic. I glanced at my cell phone. The screen showed 3:34. That made my stomach knot up again. My phone showed 3:34, but inside the workshop everything was stuck at 3:33. I backed away from the entrance, letting the door close behind me. My arms were shaking. I stood there for a minute or two until I calmed down. Then I forced myself to go back inside. When I returned, the clocks all showed 3:34. The second hands were moving again. The ticking sound came back in full force, like someone had unmuted the entire room. I let out a shaky sigh and rubbed my temples. I asked myself if I had imagined the whole thing. But the feeling in my stomach told me I hadn't. My face felt clammy, and I needed to sit down for a moment. I went to my stool and slumped onto it. The clocks kept ticking normally after that. I kept checking the time every few seconds until 4 in the morning, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I locked up and went home. The next night, I stayed in my workshop again. I wanted to see if it would happen at the same time. I worked on a small mantle clock, replacing some gears and adjusting the chimes. Around 3, I started to feel uneasy. My body tensed up and I felt a heaviness on my shoulders. I watched the minutes pass. 3:28, 3:29, 3:30. My hands began to sweat. At 3:31, I heard one of the clocks make a strange clicking sound. I looked up. The clock near my bench had stopped. The second hand was frozen on the 12. Then I noticed the rest of the clocks freezing as well, one after another. At 3:33, everything stopped again. I felt a wave of dread, but I also felt a strange curiosity. I stood up slowly and walked around the workshop. I reached out and touched one of the stopped clocks on the wall. It felt normal to me, just cold metal and glass. I tapped the glass face, but the hands didn't move. Then the whispering started again, this time behind me. I spun around and saw the same dark shape gliding near my workbench. It moved from the bench to the corner by the door. I couldn't see any features on it. It looked like a thick shadow that stayed close to the floor. My heart pounded and I leaned back against the wall, feeling the rough paint on my arms. This time, I heard the whispers more clearly. They sounded like voices overlapping each other, but they were quiet and fast. I recognized a few phrases that cut through the noise. "Wasted moments," one said. Another said, "Hours you'll never get back." I felt my chest tighten more. I remembered times in my life when I had procrastinated on important things. I remembered losing track of time on meaningless distractions. These thoughts hit me quickly, one after another, like a punch in the gut. My breathing grew shallow, and I had trouble focusing my eyes. The shape moved closer and the voices grew louder. I wanted to run, but my legs felt anchored to the ground. I forced myself to take a step toward the shape. I didn't have a plan, but I wanted to show I wasn't just going to hide. My knees felt weak, but I managed to shuffle forward. The voices paused for a second, as if they noticed me. Then they started again, whispering things about tasks I had left unfinished and projects I had abandoned. My hands shook. I couldn't think of anything to say. The shape flickered and slid across the floor toward the shelf with the spare parts. It moved behind the shelf and disappeared. I heard the ticking of the clocks return slowly, 1 second at a time. I looked up and saw the second hands begin to move. I checked the wall clock. It was 3:34 again. That's how it continued for days. Each night at 3:33, my workshop would fall silent. I tried staying outside before that time, but I felt drawn to be inside the moment it happened. It was like I needed to see if there was a chance I could figure out how to stop it. I brought in a new digital timer, but it froze along with everything else. I tried recording the moment on my phone, but the video feed always froze at 3:33 as well. When the clock started again, the video picked up as if nothing unusual had happened. Every time I saw those shadowy figures moving among the clocks. Some nights I counted 3 or 4 of them. Other nights I only saw 1 or 2. They whispered about missed opportunities or lost chances. Sometimes I heard them say my name in a low hiss. My heart would race and I'd break into a cold sweat. I sometimes felt shaky for hours afterward. I drank a lot of coffee to stay alert, but it didn't stop my hands from trembling. I tried ignoring them. I put on headphones one night, blasting music to drown out the whispers. At 3:33, the music cut off. The headphones went dead. I heard the whispers behind me, but I refused to turn around. I forced myself to look at the bench in front of me, even though my mind screamed at me to run. My skin burned with tension, and my mouth went dry. After a minute, I felt something brush against my shoulder. I leapt off my stool and yanked off the headphones. The shadow stood right next to me, shifting on the floor. I felt my stomach lurch and I stumbled away, nearly tripping on my toolbox. Then the ticking started again, and it vanished. I stayed slumped on the floor for a few minutes, trying to breathe normally. I I began sleeping in short bursts during the day, showing up at the workshop around midnight. I couldn't face customers the same way. I looked tired and jumpy, and I had trouble focusing on repairs. I kept messing up simple tasks like aligning watch hands or oiling the gear trains. One evening, I decided to lock myself in the workshop from midnight to dawn, determined to get some evidence. I set up multiple cameras in different corners. I used a few older digital cameras that could record continuously. I placed them on tripods, pointing them at the main wall clock, the shelf, and the workbench. I started recording around 2:50 in the morning, checking each camera to make sure it was working. I sat at my bench waiting for 3:33. When the time came, everything froze again. I heard the cameras stop whirring. I tried to see if any lights on them were still blinking, but they had all locked up. The shadow shapes appeared, drifting around the workshop like they owned the place. The whispers filled the air. They repeated things about my past choices and how much time I'd lost. I felt a knot in my throat. I tried not to react, but I couldn't help trembling. I kept my eyes on one shape in particular as it slid across the wall. It seemed to sense I was watching. It stopped and turned in my direction. I didn't see any eyes, but I felt its attention on me. My chest tightened, and I clenched my fists. I wanted to yell, but I couldn't get any words out. My mouth just opened and closed without sound. After about a minute, the clock started up again and the cameras resumed recording. I checked the footage on each one. Nothing showed up. It was just normal footage of me sitting at my bench, then a skip at 3:33, and then me sitting again. No shadows, no whispers. It was like I had made it all up. But I knew I hadn't. Over time, I tried different tricks. I changed the bulbs in the workshop to see if a different kind of light would help me see them better. I moved the clocks around. I tried setting alarms before 3:33 to break the pattern. Nothing worked. The clocks always froze, and the shadows always showed up. They whispered about time I had wasted or forgotten. They never hurt me physically, but they left me shaking and uneasy. One night I heard them whisper something new. We watch and we wait. That sent chills through my arms. My hands turned clammy. I kept glancing around, worried they might try something else, but they never did. They just whispered and drifted, then disappeared when the clock started moving again at 3:34. Now I still work here every night. I've gotten used to the pattern. I don't understand it, but I can't walk away from the workshop. I need to make a living, and I don't want to abandon my tools. So I stay, and I face the same moment over and over. Each time I hear those whispers, I feel my heart thud in my chest. Sometimes I want to close my eyes until it's over, but I can't help staring at the shapes, hoping to catch some detail that might explain what's going on. I've never found a clue. At this point, I accept that something strange happens every night at 3:33. All the clocks stop and those shadows show up. They whisper about my past. They remind me of the time I've spent on trivial tasks. They speak of minutes and hours I can't get back. I still don't know how to stop them or whether they'll ever go away. I just know I can't pretend they aren't real. If I try to ignore them, they come closer. If I watch them, they keep their distance. And when 3:34 arrives, they vanish, leaving me alone with the ticking of clocks that suddenly feel too loud. That's the story of what happens in my workshop. I've gone through it night after night, feeling my pulse hammer every time. I keep fixing clocks and watches for my clients because I don't know what else to do. Nothing in my life explains why this is happening, but I live with it. Each night, when the clock hits 3:33, I hold my breath and wait for those shapes to appear. And they always do, creeping around my workshop and reminding me of the moments that slipped through my fingers. Then time starts moving again, and I go on working. I don't know if it will ever stop, but I keep coming back here, waiting and listening, trying to keep my hands steady while the shadows tell me what I already know. I can't escape those missing minutes, and I can't rewind the clock. I remember the morning I moved into the cabin. I was tired from the long drive. My back felt stiff and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I had only one goal in mind: finish my novel without distractions. The cabin stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by tall trees on all sides. The wooden exterior looked old but sturdy. Inside, there was a main room with a small fireplace, a kitchen with worn countertops, and a bedroom with a single bed. I brought enough groceries for 2 weeks. There was no internet and no cell reception, which suited me just fine. I needed the isolation. I spent the first day cleaning up dust and cobwebs. I unpacked my laptop, my notes, and my printed draft. I set them on a little table near the window in the main room. The table was shaky, but it was the only decent surface I had. I noticed the quiet right away. No cars, no voices, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional creak from the trees. It felt refreshing. I thought I would write with more focus than I'd had in a long time. That first night, I sat at the table for hours, trying to rework a crucial scene in my novel. I wrote paragraph after paragraph, stopping every few minutes to read them back. The only sounds were the scratch of my pen on paper and my own breathing. When it got too late, I closed my laptop, stacked my notes, and placed the printed pages on top. Then I went to bed. I slept restlessly. The cabin was darker than any place I'd slept before. I heard the wind outside. Sometimes the rafters made groaning sounds like the wood was shifting. My hands felt cold, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. My mind wouldn't settle, but eventually, I drifted off. In the morning, I woke to faint light coming through the small window in the bedroom. My head ached, but I was hungry, so I got up to make breakfast. The floorboards creaked under my feet. After making coffee and some toast, I sat down to review what I'd done the night before. My printed pages were neatly stacked, just how I'd left them. But when I read the first page, I noticed something off. 2 sentences I didn't remember writing were there in the middle of a paragraph. The style was a little sharper, more precise. The meaning was the same, but the words were different. I rubbed my eyes and read it again. I thought maybe I was so tired that I'd forgotten my own edits. I shrugged it off, drank my coffee, and decided to keep going. I opened my laptop to see the digital version of my chapter. The changes weren't in the file. They were only on the printed pages. I told myself I must have made the edits manually before bed and forgot. I didn't feel certain about that, but I moved on. The rest of the day, I wrote a new chapter and tried not to dwell on it. My progress felt slow and my hands got cramped from typing too much. I walked around the cabin a few times to stretch. Each time I stepped onto the porch, I felt the cold air on my face. The trees seemed to close in around the cabin, and I noticed how thick the trunks were. The sky looked gray and heavy. I went back inside and got back to work. That night, I was more tired than usual. I saved my file, placed my new printed pages on top of my stack, and left my notes out again. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed. I heard a faint dripping in the sink, but I was too worn out to do anything about it. When I fell asleep, I dreamed about the same chapter I was working on, but I don't remember the details. The next morning, I woke up with a slight pain in my shoulders. I walked into the main room feeling a chill that made my skin prickle. I switched on the overhead light and saw my stack of pages had been rearranged. At first, I thought maybe I had left them crooked. But when I picked them up, I saw entire paragraphs written in a different style. My handwriting hadn't changed. These paragraphs were typed, matching my usual font and spacing, but they had phrases I never typed. Certain details were more vivid. The dialogue between my characters had better pacing, and every scene had an undercurrent of tension that I didn't remember adding. It was impressive work, but it felt more hostile, more bleak. The focus was sharper, like the story had turned darker overnight. My chest tightened and my jaw clenched. I couldn't figure out how it happened. I looked around the cabin, checking the locked door and the windows. Everything was shut tight. Nobody could have snuck in. The place felt empty. I stood there for a while, just staring at those pages. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I sat down and compared the files on my laptop to the printed pages. None of these new edits appeared on my screen. It was as if the changes happened outside my computer. I tried not to panic. I told myself it was a sign that I was working too hard. Maybe I was rewriting my pages while half asleep and not remembering. I decided to test it. I printed the pages again from my laptop and left them in a separate folder. Then I put the existing edited pages on the table, along with my notes. I wanted to see if the same changes would appear on the fresh printouts or just on the original ones. I also set up my phone to record a video overnight, even though I had barely any battery left. I hoped to catch something, maybe myself sleepwalking. That evening I cooked some canned soup on the small stove. The taste was bland, but it filled me up. The temperature had dropped. My breath felt cold in front of my face, so I lit a small fire in the fireplace. The crackling of the wood relaxed me. I tried to keep calm by reading one of my old writing guides. I managed to stay awake until midnight, then I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I shut the fire down, left my papers on the table as planned, and put my phone in the corner aimed at the table. I went to the bedroom and collapsed onto the bed without even changing clothes. The next morning, I woke up with a start. My heart was pounding, and my hands felt clammy. I walked to the main room, and the first thing I saw was the table. The printed pages on top had fresh changes again. Words were crossed out or replaced. Entire sentences were rearranged for better impact. The writing still looked like my style, but polished to an eerie degree. Even the new printouts I'd left in the separate folder had a few changes. They weren't as extensive, but there were enough to show it wasn't a fluke. Some lines were revised to reflect a gloomier tone. I grabbed my phone to check the recording. The battery was dead. I cursed under my breath and plugged it into the wall. Once it had enough charge, I watched the video. For the first few hours, nothing happened. It was just the dimly lit table and my blanketed shape in the distance as I wandered around before bed. Around 2 a.m., the screen went dark for a second, like the phone glitched. Then the recording resumed and I could see the table again, but there was a gap of about a minute. No sign of anyone in the room. The pages looked undisturbed on camera. The last few hours just showed the same empty room with no movement. I saw no person turning pages or typing. It made my stomach twist in knots. I noticed the new edits referenced facts about my personal life. Parts of the text hinted at regrets or mistakes I'd made. It felt like the story was becoming a direct commentary on my past, and it was becoming more unsettling by the day. Every time I read these new lines, I felt my chest tighten and my throat go dry. The writing was good, but it felt invasive. I tried to stay logical. I thought maybe I'd brought old memories into my story. Maybe my subconscious was playing tricks on me. So I decided to sleep during the day and work at night. I figured if something was happening in the dark, I should be awake to see it. The first day I tried this, I closed the curtains and blocked any sunlight from coming in. I lay down on the bed with a blanket over my head, but I couldn't rest. My thoughts kept circling. After a few hours, I got up and realized I'd barely dozed off. I splashed cold water on my face, then brewed coffee. My limbs felt heavy, but I forced myself to write from late afternoon until sunrise. At around 3 a.m., and I started to feel dizzy. My eyes stung and my neck felt tight. I stepped outside on the porch to get some fresh air. The night sky was clear, but there was no moonlight. I heard branches swaying. The cabin looked even more isolated in the dark. I stood there for a few minutes, then went back inside to keep working. By 5 a.m., I had a solid chunk of new writing. I felt almost proud of myself for staying awake. My phone was charging on the kitchen counter, filming the table again, but from a different angle. I sat in the same room, sipping coffee and reading over my new pages. I didn't see anything strange happen in front of me. No footsteps, no flickering lights. It was just a quiet night, and I felt a bit foolish for worrying so much. At around 6 a.m., I stepped outside again. Dawn was starting to break. I walked a few yards away from the cabin to stretch my legs. I felt the morning chill on my face. My back cracked when I twisted around. I took a deep breath, listened to the wind, and tried to clear my mind. When I returned to the cabin, I went straight to the table. Nothing looked different at first. Then I realized one page in the middle was out of alignment. I lifted the stack and saw new words added to a scene I'd just finished an hour ago. They were comments about my own life, about a past relationship I'd ended badly. It was the same type of detail that had no place in my fictional story. My stomach churned, my pulse throbbed in my temples. I checked the phone's recording right away. I saw myself leaving the cabin around 6 a.m. Then the camera glitched for a split second. When it came back, I was already walking in the door again. The pages never moved on screen. No hand touched them. No figure appeared. But the words were there. At that point, I started to feel trapped. My days blurred together. Each morning, more changes showed up in my pages. The story kept veering into darker territory. It hinted at secrets I had never planned to reveal. Private moments from my past found their way into my characters' dialogue. My mouth felt dry whenever I read them. I tried copying the entire revised text back into my laptop files, hoping to take control, but the next day, something else changed. Now the story's focus seemed to shift toward my own isolation in the cabin. It read like a personal journal. The tone was bleak. It described the tension I felt every night, like it was narrating my exact situation. My hands would tremble as I turned the pages. I started to worry that I was losing my mind. I tried to call a friend from the city, but I had no reception. I thought about driving to a gas station to make a call, but part of me felt compelled to stay. I had come here to finish my novel, and I was strangely fascinated by these edits. They were better than anything I'd come